Wyoming Territory, June 6, 1882. The wind swept dry and restless across the empty churchyard, dragging dust over the worn grass and under the chapel doors. Florence Fairburn stood alone in her white dress, the hem she had sewn herself brushing her boots as she stared down the road where her groom had sworn he'd ride from. He did not come. The chapel, built by hand with timber her father had hewn from the North Ridge, creaked with whispers. Neighbors shifted in the pews, murmuring behind gloved hands. Her aunt clutched a damp handkerchief. Her younger brother, 15 and wide-eyed, kept glancing at the door like he could will Nathan McCrae to appear. But Florence kept her gaze fixed on the horizon, the bones of her faith still holding, though her heart was starting to slip beneath the weight. Someone behind her whispered, "Maybe he's just late," but the words felt thin and foolish. Nathan McCrae was not coming. She had fed the chickens at dawn, mucked the barn, and still found time to tuck lilacs in her hair. She had believed every word he'd told her, that he'd build a cabin by fall, that they'd raise horses, that she'd never have to carry water by herself again. Lies, all of it. Her knees wobbled beneath the folds of white fabric, but she refused to fall. She would not give them the satisfaction of watching her collapse. With her hands clenched tight at her sides, she turned from the altar. Then the chapel door creaked open. A man stood in the threshold, hat in hand, trail dust clinging to his coat and boots. He was tall and lean, with a sun-worn face and eyes the color of storm clouds rolling in from the west. Every head in the chapel turned. Florence blinked, her breath catching. He wasn't her groom, but something in the way he looked at her direct, unflinching, steadied her. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said, voice low and rough, scraped raw by trail wind and silence. "But I heard a woman was being left at the altar, and I could not let that stand." Gasps fluttered through the pews. Her aunt nearly dropped her handkerchief, but the stranger looked only at Florence, like she was someone who still mattered, someone worth standing up for. "My name is Kellenroe," he continued. "I work cattle on a ranch west of the river. I don't know what promises he gave you, but I'll marry you today if you'll have me." Florence stared at him. The chapel fell into a stunned, motionless hush. Her heart pounded loud in her ears. He was serious, not a flicker of humor or mockery in his face, just quiet, deliberate courage. She should have said no, should have walked out, chin high, and let the gossip curl behind her like dust in the wake of a passing wagon. But something deep inside her stirred, something raw and unquiet, something desperate to live. "You don't even know me," she said, her voice shaking. "I know you deserve better than being left behind," he answered simply. Her fingers tightened around her bouquet. She looked to the preacher, who still stood frozen behind the altar. Her voice cracked as she spoke, but she held his gaze. "I'm Florence Fairburn," she said, "and if you mean what you say, then yes, I will marry you." A collective breath filled the church like wind through dry grass. The preacher blinked back to life, his hands trembling as he opened his book. Kellen stepped forward and took her hand, warm, rough, sure, and held it like he meant to keep it. They exchanged vows right there, beneath the cedar rafters, surrounded by townsfolk too stunned to speak. Florence's voice wavered, but she finished every word. Kellen said his part with quiet strength, like every word mattered. And when the preacher declared them husband and wife, the church erupted in a wave of surprised, hesitant applause. They walked out into the sun as strangers, now bound by vows. Florence didn't know where the road would lead, but she knew one thing: she wouldn't be walking it alone. Kellen's wagon was plain, worn by years of use, drawn by a sturdy bay mare with kind eyes. He helped her up with gentle hands and murmured, "Careful now," before climbing up beside her and taking the reins. They left the chapel behind, the wind carrying the last of the whispers away as they rolled toward open prairie. He spoke only when spoken to. She learned he was 29, had worked cattle since he was 13, and had no family left. He'd come into town for supplies and heard talk at the mercantile about a wedding turned cold. Couldn't let it be, he said, no elaboration. Just that. The sun was beginning to lean low when they reached his land. It was modest, but clean: a barn, a well, and a small cabin with smoke curling from its chimney like a promise. Florence looked at it all, still wearing her wedding dress, "You live alone?" she asked. "I do." She hesitated at the door. He noticed. "I can sleep in the barn, if you'd prefer," he offered. His voice without pressure. She studied his face, earnest, steady. "Just for tonight," she said. He gave a small nod and carried her trunk inside. That night, Florence lay awake in a narrow bed while the moon painted silver lines across the walls. Her dress hung from a nail by the door. Her hands were still trembling, not from fear, but from something warmer that had started in the chapel when Kellen took her hand, and hadn't faded since. She rose before dawn the next morning. The kitchen was small, but everything she needed was there. She made biscuits and eggs and walked them out to the barn, plate still warm in her hands. Kellen was brushing down a mare near the corral. He looked up, surprised. "I thought I'd feed my husband," she said. His expression softened, the faintest smile reaching his eyes. He took the plate gently. "You didn't have to. I know." They stood side by side in silence, the wind tugging at her hair as she tucked it behind her ear. The prairie stretched out endless before them. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I didn't do it for thanks. I know that, too." The days passed without ceremony. Florence tied her apron at her waist and scrubbed her hands with lice soap until they cracked. Kellen asked for nothing. He worked the land with the steadiness of someone who used his body more than words, and she found the silence between them unexpectedly restful. On the third morning, she stepped outside before first light. The air smelled of dew and last night's ash. She found Kellen already splitting wood, his motions rhythmical and sure. The thud of the axe echoed across the yard. "You always start before sunup?" she asked. He paused, leaned on the axe handle. "Only way to stay ahead." "I could help," she offered. His brow rose. "You ever split wood?" "No," she admitted. "But I've hauled water in winter and swung a hoe through clay like iron. I'll figure it out." He didn't laugh. He just handed her the axe, placing it in her grip with a kind of careful reverence. She missed her first swing, but when she glanced at him, there was no judgment in his eyes, only patience. By the fourth swing, the logs split clean. "You learn quick," he said. That night, he sat across the table from her as she peeled turnips. His right hand, wrapped in cloth, rested near his plate. "What happened to your hand?" she asked. "Colt kicked, stone under his hoof. Pressed too hard. You should have told me. I could have cleaned it. I rinsed it in the creek. That's not the same." He studied her for a moment, then silently pushed his plate aside and offered his hand. She unwrapped the cloth carefully. The cut wasn't deep, but it was red around the edges. "You kept working like this," she murmured. "There's no one else to do it. I'm here now." He didn't reply, but his fingers curled around hers before she let go later. The house dimmed with oil lamp light, and the dishes lay clean in the basin. Florence stood by the window, while the wind rattled the shutters. "You've been alone a long time," she said. Not turning around. "I got used to it. I don't think I ever will." His boots scraped the floor as he crossed to stand beside her. She could feel his warmth without looking. "You don't have to," he said. She didn't answer, but she didn't step away either. The wind outside softened, and the silence between them became something that didn't need filling, something like hope. He said it quietly, almost as if unsure she'd respond. She turned to face him, her voice steady but soft. "I didn't say I wouldn't try." He gave a single, silent nod, then took a step back toward the door. "I'll sleep in the loft." Again, she didn't stop him, but after the lamp was turned down and the silence of the house settled deep into the floorboards, she folded the quilt from the foot of the bed and placed it near the hearth, just in case the wind crept in through the chinks in the wood. That night, she lay beneath thin blankets, her eyes open longer than they ought to have been, watching the flicker of the dying fire on the ceiling, wondering if anything in her life had ever unfolded the way it was supposed to. She woke to the smell of coffee. It filled the cabin, dark and rich and already brewed. When she stepped into the kitchen, Cullen was setting a plate of cornmeal cakes on the table. His sleeves were rolled, hair still damp from the pump. "You don't have to cook for me," she said. "I know," he replied, glancing at her. "Figured you might like a morning off." She sat down slowly, watching him pour a second cup of coffee, his movements unrushed, unceremonious. "What's the occasion?" fences down on the north side, he said, picking up his hat. I'll be gone most of the day. I can walk the west line while you're out, she offered, reaching for her boots. He paused. You don't need to prove anything. I'm not, she said, eyes steady. I just don't like sitting still. Something flickered in his expression then, not doubt, not surprise, more like recognition. He gave a short nod. All right, but take the rifle. Cougar's been sniffing near the Gulch Trail. She nodded, already pulling on her boots, fingers fast and sure on the laces. He lingered in the doorway. You always this steady? She looked up at him, brushing a wisp of hair from her face. Only when I don't have the choice not to be. He held her gaze for a long, unreadable moment, then tipped his hat and stepped outside. The door shut behind him with a soft thud. Florence found the broken section of fence before noon, just past the stand of box elders where the land began to dip toward the creek. The post had rotted through at its base, and one rail lay half-sunk in the muddy remnants of spring runoff. She crouched down, brushed dirt from the splinters, and assessed what she'd need. By the time she returned with a replacement post and handsaw, the sun was near its peak, the air thick with horseflies and heat. She rolled her sleeves high, sweat darkening the back of her dress as she worked. By mid-afternoon, the new rail was set, snug and solid, not perfect, but strong enough to hold Dot as she stood, wiping her palms on her apron. A breath of wind drifted through the tall grass, bringing with it a smell dry and sharp, smoke. She turned toward the scent. South of the ridge, a thin column of gray smoke rose in a slow spiral against the hard blue sky. She watched it for a long moment, then slung the rifle over her shoulder and started walking. Dot, it wasn't far, half a mile, maybe less. The trail narrowed as it climbed, deer tracks, pressed deep into the soft dirt. When she crested the hill, she saw him, Kellen, crouched beside a fire no larger than a skillet, something cooking in a battered tin pan. His coat lay folded nearby, sleeves pushed up, his hat resting in the grass beside one boot. When he looked up and saw her, he didn't seem surprised. Fences patched, she said as she stepped into the clearing. He stood, brushing his hands on his trousers. Figured you'd still be out. Didn't expect you to come this way. I smelled the fire. He nodded, then shifted aside, making room near the warmth. Rabbit. Caught him this morning. She sank to the ground, crossing her legs beneath her. He handed her a tin plate without a word. The meat was lean and stringy, but he'd salted it, and it tasted better than it should have. You sleep much last night? She asked. Enough, he said. Then after a pause, there was a storm a few years back, ripped the roof off this ridge. I used to camp here sometimes when I was riding night watch. Still feels steady. For whatever reason, she looked round. The trees were young, their trunks pale and narrow, reaching upward like fingers aching for sunlight. You never fixed the roof. No point. Just me out here. She finished her bite, then set the plate aside. You ever think about leaving? He didn't answer at first. I did. Once, when my brother died. Thought I'd head east, maybe find rail work. But I couldn't leave him behind. He's buried up near the cottonwoods, under a flat stone. She glanced over. His face had gone still, the lines around his mouth pulled tight. He was younger, she asked. 2 years. Meaner than a bull and twice as loud. A brief smile flickered at the corners of his mouth. But he stuck by me. When everything else went sideways. She didn't ask what sideways meant. His voice had dropped into a place that didn't need more questions. I'm sorry you lost him, she said quietly. He nodded, eyes on the fire. You ever think about leaving? She pulled her knees up, wrapped her arms around them. Once, after my mother died, I thought maybe Kansas City, maybe Omaha. But then Pa leaned hard into the bottle and I couldn't leave my brother. With that, he looked at her, his gaze quiet but listening. You still think about it? She shook her head. I've seen enough miles. There's not much difference out there. Just more of the same with different names. They sat like that for a while. The last of the rabbit bones cooling in the grass, the fire crackling down to red coals. When the sun dipped below the ridge, he stood and stamped out the flames. She helped him gather the pan, the tin cup, his coat. He didn't offer to carry her rifle. He'd seen her shoot one clean through a rabbit's eye and hadn't spoken a word about it. Just nodded. They walked back through tall grass that rustled like water, the sky softening into dusk. The silence between them wasn't empty, it had weight, like stones carried in the palm for comfort. "Florence," he said as the cabin came into view. She stopped, turned to face him. "I know this started strange. I don't expect you to feel anything you don't. But if you ever do, if there's a day you look at me and see more than what I offered in that church, I'd be proud to be more than just a name in your ledger." She looked at him, her face unreadable in the waning light. "I'll know when that day comes," she said, "and when it does, I'll tell you myself." He nodded. They walked the rest of the way home without speaking again, but when they stepped inside, she didn't go straight to the bedroom. She took down a second plate from the shelf and set it beside hers. By the time August settled in, the heat rolled in waves that shimmered along the ridge and turned the fields to brittle gold. The well pump moaned with every pull. The chickens panted in the shade of the lean-to, wings lifted from their sides. Florence kept her hair braided tight, the sweat slipping down her back as she moved through the days. She and Kellen had found a rhythm not born of spoken agreement, but of necessity, a quiet, mutual gravity. She knew which of his shirts needed patching before he asked. He left the gate unlatched when he rode to the far pasture, knowing she'd want to check the calves herself. They circled around one another like parts of the same cartwheel, sometimes out of step, but always turning toward the same center. One evening, Florence sat on the porch steps with her boots off, rubbing the ache from her arches. The sky was streaked in orange, the smell of dust and sage thick in the air. Kellen came up from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag, squinting into the low sun. "That brindle cow's favoring her back leg," he said. "Might be a sprain. She let you close, no, but she didn't charge. I'll call that progress." Florence smiled faintly, pulling one foot onto her lap. "You ever have cattle that weren't half wild?" "Once," he said. "Old man in Nebraska bred 'em near. Tame, wouldn't last through a proper winter. Too soft." She glanced at him. "So you trust the wild ones more? They don't pretend to be anything they're not." She folded her arms across her knees. "I don't think I ever learned how to pretend." He sat beside her, leaving space between them. "I figured that out the day you looked me in the eye and said yes." She picked at a loose thread on her hem. "Wasn't sure you'd stay after I gave my word. Plenty of men do," she said. "Doesn't mean they keep it." He didn't reply at first, just leaned forward, elbows on his thighs, watching the tall grass bow under the breeze. "You wanted to ask me something," he said finally. She turned toward him. "What makes you say that?" "You've been watching me like you're measuring lumber for a frame." She hesitated, then asked quietly, "Have you ever been in love before?" He didn't flinch. "Once. A girl in Dakota Territory." She had a laugh that carried clean across the yard, sharp and unexpected, like sunlight breaking through cloud. "What happened to her?" Florence asked. "She married a banker," Kellen replied, his voice flat, like a stone skipping once, then sinking. Florence nodded slowly. "Was that what she wanted?" Kellen looked down at his hands, rough from the land and stained by work. "It's what her father wanted." The silence that followed wasn't empty, it stretched, thick and unspoken, filled with things neither of them could quite reach. Then, softer now, she asked, "Did it ruin you for trying again?" He shook his head. "No, but it taught me not to mistake kindness for promise." She rested her chin on her knee. "That's not what I'm doing, I know." The last edge of sunlight slipped behind the ridge, drawing long shadows across the porch. Cicadas had begun their chorus in the cottonwoods, and from down near the creek, a bullfrog offered his deep, echoing call. Kellen stood and stretched, his shirt clinging faintly with the weight of the day's labor. "I'll bring in the lantern. You want tea?" She didn't look up. "I'd rather hear you play." He paused in the doorway, silhouetted against the glow inside. "I haven't touched the fiddle since spring. You don't have to be." "Good," she said, quiet but certain, just honest. Their eyes met for a moment, and whatever he saw in her face sent him back through the door without another word. When he returned, the bow was freshly rosined, the strings tuned low and careful. He sat on the porch rail and began to play, not with the polished notes of a stage-trained musician, but with something older, Something truer. His bow moved slow across the strings, drawing out reels that wandered like river water through late summer grass. The music wasn't flashy, it didn't need to be. It breathed with the pauses between notes, with the quiet between words. Florence leaned back against a porch post, her eyes half-lidded, her breath falling into rhythm with the melody. The sound wrapped around her like the twilight itself, warm, tender, full of meaning left unspoken. When the last note faded, she spoke without opening her eyes. It's strange, isn't it? How a thing can feel like home before you've ever called it that. Kellen didn't move. Is that what this is starting to feel like? She didn't answer with words. She simply reached out, laid her hand over his, her fingers brushing the calloused ridges and old scars. He turned his palm up and held on, not tight, not asking, just steady. They stayed like that as the stars appeared one by one, quietly, with no need to speak. The first frost came during the final week of September. Mornings turned sharp enough to catch in the chest, and the ground creaked beneath their boots, splitting in long, delicate cracks. Florence stepped outside early, her shawl drawn tight around her shoulders, and watched her breath rise like smoke from a chimney. The garden had collapsed overnight, lettuce curled like fists, beans shriveled, and every leaf wore the color of retreat. She stood over the beds until Kellen came behind her, silent as always. He crouched to lift a clump of frozen soil. We'll need to pull what's left today, he said, before the ground locks us out for good. She nodded, already kneeling, her fingers going red with cold as she eased carrots loose from the frost-bitten dirt. They worked without speaking. The sky stayed low and gray all morning, the kind of sky that held snow just behind its breath but never let it fall. By noon the baskets were full, and Kellen had started cutting down the last of the cornstalks. Florence carried the crates into the root cellar, where she'd laid down fresh straw days earlier. As she stacked them, the door above creaked open again. I found something, Kellen said, stepping down into the cold. He held out a folded piece of yellowing paper. She took it, brow furrowing. Where was it? Tucked under a beam in the barn loft, slipped between the boards. Looked like it had been there a while. The letter was written in small, deliberate script. She read slowly, lips moving soundlessly. When she finished, she looked up. It's from your brother, she said. Kellen's jaw tightened. I figured. He wrote it for you. Said he hoped you'd find it one day. That he was proud of you. That you never quit, even when everyone else might have run. He didn't say anything. Not at first. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and even. He carried more than he told me. I should have seen it. You see what you're allowed to see, she said gently, same as anyone. She folded the letter and tried to hand it back, but he shook his head. Keep it, he said. He'd have wanted someone like you to know the good in him. That night, she tucked the letter into the box beneath her sewing basket, beside her mother's thimble and the silver comb she'd carried west. She never asked why Kellen hadn't mentioned it before. Some things didn't need to be dragged into the light. Some things lived just fine under quiet. 2 days later, Kellen came in after dusk, his shirt torn and blood seeping down his arm. The bull calf had panicked during branding and driven him into a nail. Florence didn't say a word. She poured whiskey into a bowl, cleaned the wound, and threaded the needle. Her hands were steady as she stitched, quick, sure, and practiced. His skin flinched beneath her touch, but he didn't pull away. You're steadier than most field medics I've seen, he said as she tied the last knot. I learned early. He looked at her then, searching something in her face. A broken bottle did worse to my father once. I was 12. Her voice was quiet. You never talk about him. There's no use in bitterness, she said. It rots just like everything else. When the bandage was wrapped and secure, she didn't move to leave. Instead, she rested her palm over it, gentle, lingering. You would have made a fine doctor, he said. I wanted that, once, but no one trained women. And I didn't have anyone to teach me. You taught yourself. She didn't answer, but her gaze didn't move from his face. He reached up, brushed a loose curl from her cheek. You're not just kind, Florence. You're capable. And you deserve someone who sees both. She leaned into his touch without hesitation. I do. He cupped her face then, his hand rough but reverent. She tilted her chin. And when their lips met, it wasn't shy or searching, it was certain. A kiss not born of curiosity, but of understanding. That night, she didn't close the bedroom door behind her, and he never went back to the loft again, that by winter. They moved like to halves of the same thought. She mended his shirts by firelight, while he carved her a writing desk from pine. They read aloud most nights, her voice steady with the poetry she'd brought west, his silence full of listening. He taught her how to shoe horses when the farriers stopped coming. She taught him how to can preserves when the cellar grew to full. They argued now and then, not harsh, but honest, and they always ended the day beside each other, hands tangled beneath the quilt she'd stitched from pieces of both their lives. One April morning, he came in with a bundle wrapped in burlap. "It's a peach tree," he said. "Won't bear fruit for a few years, but I thought, maybe someday." She knelt beside him in the thawing earth and planted it with bare hands. Someday's a good word. They chose the clearing behind the house where the light lingered longest. She named the tree after her mother. He didn't ask why, he just nodded. Later that spring, they rode into town together. She wore a blue dress sewn from bolts traded with the tanner's wife. He shaved for the first time since they'd met. They signed the deed together, their names written side by side in ink and trust. Folks in town said she'd tamed him. Others said he'd steadied her. But those words weren't quite right. They hadn't changed each other. They'd simply made space for growth, for healing, for love to take root. When her brother came through that fall, taller now, sure, he stayed for supper and slept in the barn. He watched them from the porch that night, eyes catching on how Kellen's hand came to rest at the small of her back without thought. "You look like you belong here," he said, and she did. The following spring, the peach tree bloomed. She stood beneath it, hands resting gently over a new curve at her waist. Kellen came up behind her, arms circling her in silence. Together they watched the blossoms fall, soft as snow. "I didn't think I'd ever feel safe again," she whispered. "You are," he said. "You're home." And she was. They built their life slow, with care and with truth. No grand declarations, just two people who chose each other over and over. In all the quiet places where love begins and where, if given time, it stays.